we're talking about how that was his premier movie where he actually comes across not only just as a interesting character, but as a good actor and steals the whole movie, man. Like his character in that movie steals the entire cinematic piece, as it were. And he's from Georgia, and he's a dentist. All right, Mad Madison. Madeline, right? You're Mad Madeline, right? Mad Madison. Will you flip these things over here? But what's that? Having issues today? I have issues every day.
Suffering from cocaine.
Yes, I am.
He was like, I made the palette.
What's a notebook? That thing?
Go to the next page after the title. Yeah. Oh,
That's all I got.
Look, this is Goliath toilet paper. You'll have to get that. Yeah, there's room for the whatever you're talking about. Here's a chair you can sit in. I'm not barefoot. I'm in socks.
Without shoes.
Yeah, that's right. Not rabbit foot. All right. Let's go ahead and start. Let's go ahead and stop. Light when you come back here, that back little, I think it's to the right. So they can see a little better. Can you see it a little better?
Oh my gosh.
Well, can you see the first day?
Papa. Blew my mind. All right, so it's not that dark. All right, so to do it, you just use these things. All right.
Don't tell her on that one.
Oh my God.
Don't tell her.
All right, here we go. Moral relativism. So we're talking about ethics, right? I'm not going to talk about it with that. All right, so we're talking about ethics, right? Now, is this an ethical theory? Usually I almost always end with this. Like we'll go through every ethical theory and then end with this one. But I wanted to reverse that and talk about this first. And then maybe that'll become clear to you. I think it works better first. So if we're talking about ethical theories, is this an ethical theory, moral relativism?
Yes.
No, not really. Why?
Could it be? Not saying it's right or
Because this is just dismisses what?
this dismisses the idea of morality,
Of
right?
any sort of true objective ethical theory, right?
Yeah, everything's relative. There's no, true standard.
Right. So what we're going to talk about first is, because remember, like we talked about the other day, all of these ethical theories are going to try to not just show you how to behave, but why certain behaviors are right or wrong, right? Why they're good in the moral sense behaviors or bad, excuse me, behaviors in the moral sense, right? Now, moral relativism, we're going to talk about essentially two types of this. Well, first, before we say that, you can go ahead and flip the thing. Before we say that, is what are some arguments? Oh man, the audio doesn't work, so you don't get to hear this. Who's ever heard this from the soundtrack, the Fight Club movie? This is the Tyler Durden thing where he basically they put a couple of his little statements and stuff together with a backdrop of music, and he essentially just argues for some sort of nihilism, really, is what he's saying the entire time. Like, you're not a unique snowflake, you're not this, we're all part of the same decaying dung heap, all that stuff. And I wish it would play, but the audio is not working on there for some reason. So what are some arguments for moral relativism to begin with? What do you think?
Nothing good.
Well, we'll evaluate that in a moment. But what do you think some arguments for moral relativism are? The lady on the right there, we've got a PDF of that I can send out if you actually want to read that. But essentially, she's an anthropologist, sociologist type lady that talks about how just the observation of cultures and all these kind of things. So what might be what might be an argument for moral relativism?
That like good and bad is dependent on culture. Like in this culture, this is bad, but in this culture.
Right, in this culture they do this, right, in this culture they do that. Over here they do this, over here they do that. So therefore morals are completely relative, all this kind of stuff, right? And what we're going to talk about is that would be a version of, and we'll get to this in a second, where it says a society says type relativism, also known as society says relativism, also known as conventionalism, or cultural relativism. And then we'll say this in a second, and this will come up in a second when I tell her to go there. And I say relativism. So you'll have a society says and then I say type relativism. But anyway, so what might be the benefits of something like moral relativism? What might be something that, at least on the face of it, is a positive for moral relativism? Yeah, that the lady's name on the left, she has like a 5-paragraph thing, and I should have already had it pulled up, but I didn't. But the lady on the left has a she has a very articulate little 4 or 5 paragraph piece that essentially argues for moral relativism in the context of pro-choice. She was one of the ex-presidents of Planned Parenthood, and so she writes this very eloquent, very well spoken little piece that argues for moral relativism. Go ahead.
Well, if there is like a higher moral standard, then most of us will probably be wrong. Most of us are violating that standard. So I guess if you had like moral relativism, if that's true, if morality is dependent upon culture, like everyone's kind of right versus most people.
Right. So what do you think the positive spin on that would be? So would you say that it promotes something like tolerance?
Yeah.
So if everybody's culture is what deems what's right or wrong, and then even more so on the I say relativism, if everybody's morality is completely subjective, well then you can't really, on the face of it, say something like, that's why you can't say that everybody has to obey your morality or this, because all that's subjective, right? Or that's dependent upon your culture. So on the face of it, at least, it looks like that it gives you a sort of tolerance and respect for other cultures and whatnot, because, hey, look, we've all got this different morality, so, we can't expect all these other things, right? You can't cram your moral beliefs down other people's throats or whatever, right? Does that seem to make sense? So that might, on the face of it, be some sort of positive, right? What else? We've already talked a little bit about what would look like an argument for moral relativism. Say, for instance, like the witch trials, right? We talked about the Salem witch trials, right? Like they burned witches then, but now we don't burn witches now, so our morality's changed, right? Stuff like that. Or even the thing like, look, Bin Laden and those guys thought it was morally right to fly planes into buildings, right? Our buildings, and we thought that was literally the exact opposite, that was morally wrong. So that would, we kind of touched on that earlier about, right, yeah. So we kind of touched on that earlier, right, about how, now, of course, when we were talking about that, we already kind of, in a way, already addressed why that may not work, but at least, again, just to try to pull some of that back out into the open there to look like maybe some sort of argument for moral relativism, right? That these cultures disagree and all these sorts of things, right? Now let's start to go ahead and if you guys can't think, I mean, again, if you can think of anything else that's positive, say it so we can go ahead and pull that out.
I mean, you mentioned not shoving your beliefs down other people's throats, but I don't really think that's dependent on moral will. Just not being an asshole.
Yeah, that's it.
Well, I think that everybody would probably agree. Well, and that may be a problem in this view, and we'll talk about that in a second. But I think that any ethical theory would say that you shouldn't be, an a-hole, right?
Yeah, I will hope.
Right. I mean, I honestly don't know any ethical theory. I mean, that's why we have the word a-hole,
Yeah, I mean,
right? I mean, that's why we have the word a-hole, right? Because there's no ethical theory that supports that, right? You don't say, oh, a-holes are deontologists. Oh, or a-holes are virtue theorists. Oh, or a-holes are utilitarians, right? A-holes are what? A-holes. We have a word for that already, right? There's not an ethical theory for that, right? Except maybe, we'll see this one maybe. All right, so go ahead and flip to the next thing. This is what I was saying was just your society says conventionalism or cultural relativism, and then a type of relativism, something like I say relativism, which would be completely subjective, right? That morality is completely subjective to the person. Now, why do you think it's fun for us to talk about? What's fun for me? Why do you think it's fun for us to talk about moral relativism and to go through it?
why it's fun.
Yeah. One, I just like to critique stuff, right? I mean, this is a philosophy class. But then two, because moral relativism is one of the biggest views that everybody your age holds, right? So to me, it's fun to talk about how dumb college kids are.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding. Kinda kidding, not kidding. Kinda kidding, not kidding. But anyway, seriously, why do you think it might be interesting to talk about this? I mean, I did kind of touch on it.
I'm really offended by that. And I can't believe that you would say such a thing. That was kind of, yeah, sorry, dancing on the grave, literally. Like, literally.
Well,
Dancing on the grave,
Yeah.
literally.
well, because again, even though, I mean, I kind of said it was that there's so many college age individuals and even in culture at large that supposedly embrace moral relativism, right? As if it's a superior sort of view in some sense, right? I mean, that's just popular notion. Right. Yeah. To use a word I like to use all the time. Now, we're going to go ahead and start to look at and get to some of the criticisms of moral relativism, because there's just a lot, and I want to make sure we get through these because they're just really fun to talk about. So what we want to do is we want to go ahead and pull it completely out into the open right off the bat. We want to strip away all the silliness and just start to look at some of the arguments, but then also come at it and look at it seriously right at the onset. So let's start kind of with something like I say relativism, that morality is literally subjective to each individual. Lacey has her morality, I have my morality. You back off, you got yours, I got mine, right? Something like that kind of view. Or that, hey, look, everybody in this class has to, at the end of the day, based on their own, under their best understanding, has to come to believe what they need to believe for themselves in regards to moral issues, right? In fact, this is something like what Faye Walterton argued earlier in the thing that we were talking about, that kind of view. So if morality, again, let's look at it in the completely subjective sense. I say relativism, morality is dependent on the subject. Each individual person comes to their view in regards to morality. Then, and I was going to try to pull up some pictures to go along with this as well, but I just came up with a statement instead, so we can look at that. You can go ahead and flip over to that. And it would be something like this. So if morality is completely subjective to the individual, then say this statement right here, the first statement, that forcible rape is a moral wrong that ought to be eliminated, is what? Logically equivalent to what? Philosophically equivalent to what?
Well, I mean, it's got a point. No, ice cream does it for you.
Right, it is, right?
It's got a point.
It's logically equivalent to the statement that forcible rape against a child is morally wrong. I guess I took that out there. But forcible rape against a child is a moral wrong that must be eliminated. is what?
Whether they're both.
It's philosophically equivalent to vanilla ice cream is very tasty, right? Why are those philosophically equivalent under moral relativism?
Because it's all based on your purview. And your purview could be saying that. But there's something that's grounded in objectivity.
Right. If forcible rape against a child is a moral wrong that must be eliminated, that's your moral view, right? It's not mine. That's yours.
Well,
So that's like
say that.
that's like saying, again, that's like saying that, all right, you know, you like vanilla ice cream, I like chocolate ice cream, right? Or you like Brussels sprouts, I don't like Brussels sprouts. Or you like broccoli, I don't like broccoli. I like Brussels sprouts, you like broccoli. So that's literally the philosophically and logically, that's the equivalent when you talk about moral issues. Why?
They're just your opinion.
Because they're completely subjective, right? What gives them their quote unquote truth value? The subject? Are they objective? Meaning the object themselves outside of the subject? No, not objective outside of the subject, subjective to the person, right? That's what gives them their quote unquote truth value is the subject. So when you say that vanilla ice cream tastes better, what gives that the truth value? The subject, right? That's a subjective claim. You know, to you, vanilla ice cream is better than chocolate ice cream, right? This is the same exact, or this is the logical equivalent of moral views as well on what? Moral relativism. Because there's no truth outside of you, right? You are what makes that true. So if vanilla ice cream is more tasty to you, you are what makes that statement true, right? It's subjective, not objective, right? So first, that's kind of the first thing that we want to look at, again, to try to just draw this out immediately into the open. So one of the other ways that I thought about doing that, and I didn't really find anything that was necessarily adequate. Yeah, that's redundant, isn't it? Was that there's this one picture, and I wanted to try to show this, but there's this one picture of because it's one thing to describe it, but to see it is has a completely different impact, where you see like there's this old school, when I was doing my undergrad, we were in history class, we had to watch this video where they show this video where these Nazi guards are taking away the children of these Jewish ladies. And of course it's silent. There's no, audio to go along with it. But you're watching them. I mean, you can't hear it, but you see the mothers just sobbing. And I mean, freaking some of their fingernails are ripping off, just trying to hold on to their kids while the guards are just taking them away from them, the Nazi guards. So I wanted to find a still shot of that and have that up to basically highlight the same principle, that this image is philosophically equivalent to, and then it shows like a mom, holding her child and caring for her and loving her. But there's literally no difference between the two under moral relativism. Why? Because again, you are what makes it right or wrong, right? There's no objective standard by which to judge those two actions, right? Those two actions, the one where you see the Nazi guards, ripping away the children from their parents, from the moms, and the mommy or whatever, holding and comforting her child, those two actions are morally what? Equivalent. There's no difference, morally speaking, between the two. It's literally like having a conversation on vanilla ice cream versus chocolate ice cream. Which one tastes better? Well, neither is really any better. It's just your preference. Neither one of those actions, the guards stripping away the children from their mommies or whatever, there's literally no difference between the two actions. It's just your preference, whichever you want. So let's start looking at, we're going to run a reductio. Remember, reductio ad absurdum is a form of argument which takes a particular conclusion and tries to make it look, and tries to show the absurd consequences. So you can go ahead and flip that. The first is this. Moral relativists can't accuse others of wrongdoing. Why? And this would apply for both A and B. Society says would be A, B would be I say relativism. Moral relativists can't accuse others of wrongdoing. Why? Right. It just may be wrong for you, right? Which again is just to say that you don't like the way something tastes, right? But you can't accuse anybody else of any real sort of wrongdoing. Why? Because they're the ones that determine what? Whether or not it's right or wrong for themselves, right? Right? Under moral relativism, that's just the consequence. You can't even accuse anyone else of any sort of real wrongdoing. You can say that you don't like what they're doing, right? But again,
somebody like murder a hobo in an alley
Mhm.
or something in Atlanta, I can't go up to that guy and go, dude, that's wrong.
not if you're a moral relativist, because he can say what?
So
It's wrong for you.
yeah,
It's wrong for you, not for me. Or if he's really on top, what's that?
Are my religions still
Right. Right. So, or somebody, or like, let's say you've got somebody that's really sharp and you come up, say you're both moral relativists, and you come up and you say, man, that's wrong. You can't do that. And he's like, I don't care. It's better than cornflakes. That's your preference. Right. So that's the same thing. Like, shut up with your preference. I don't care about your if I want to know your preference, I'll ask you your preference. If I want to do this, I'll do this. Again, that's like you saying, hey, man, you can't eat chocolate ice cream. You got to eat vanilla ice cream. So I don't care about your preference. So moral relativists can't accuse anyone of any wrongdoing with any weight behind it. There's no moral weight behind it, right? Except who? Your own, but not theirs. Doesn't matter, right? All right, so go ahead. Number 2. We've talked about this before, so we'll just go ahead and flop by this. If you're truly holding this on, if you're truly grasping at or holding to moral relativism, then any sort of objective evil, complain against whatever, whether it be God's existence, some sort of theistic position, or whether it just be the state of the world, whatever, you can't complain about that, right? Because there's just not any, right? Except on what? Your own view or preference, right? Somebody else may say, well, I think it's perfectly fine, whatever the case may be. All right, so we'll go ahead and skip that one. We've already kind of touched on that before. Now, this is an odd one. Moral relativists can't place blame or accept praise. Now, let's talk about the first one in that list initially. So why can't a moral relativist place blame in any sort of real sense of the word, robust sense of the word? Well, because what does blame imply? That something's wrong, right? That there was a wrong way of behavior, right? So, for instance, imagine that you're, say that you and your spouse or whatever, you have, you come together, in your relationship with one another in the sexual union, and your spouse becomes pregnant, and let's say your spouse decides she wants to, smoke and drink and do all these sorts of things. Well, so the child is born, right? And it's severely handicapped, severely deformed, all sorts of mental disabilities, physical disabilities, on and on and on and on. Well, can the dad, if under moral relativism, can the father place blame on the mother for what she's done? No. Why?
Because what she was doing isn't wrong.
Because there just is no wrong, right? Unless she deems it as wrong, right? But if she says, look, you think it's wrong to do these sorts of things. I don't. So you literally have what that turns into is something like a mathematical equation. Like you can still say that the mom, so 1 + 1 = 2. You can still say that the mom did this and this, which results in this. You can say in that sense she's responsible, right? But it's just an antecedent, a consequent, and then the conclusion of that, right? But there's no moral connotations here, right? You can still say she's responsible in the same way that 1 + 1 when added together = 2, right? But you can't say that she's what? Morally responsible. There's no blame. You can't use the word blame in any sort of robust sense of the true sense of the word of what it means to blame someone. Now, the contra of that is what's really funny, because moral relativists will often point out that, hey, look, morals are completely relative. You can't blame them for blah, blah. But what do people turn around and do almost immediately afterwards? 5 minutes later. Accept praise. But how can you accept praise? Let me word it this way. Why can moral relativists not accept praise? Right, some standard that they're getting close towards, right? Oh, so-and-so sacrificed his life for all of these people in, World War II, and so we're going to give him a Medal of Honor or whatever. Well, moral relativists would be like, true moral relativism would be like, well, but that's assuming that that's any better than, betraying all of his.
It's just funny,
His
he's
fellow soldiers.
dead, like he sacrificed his life, and like you're arguing whether or not he gets a medal, and I'm thinking like, he doesn't carry his sin.
Well, I mean, no, they do that post, what's now the word slips my mind.
Yeah,
Not post-humanely, what is it, post what?
I like the way it's.
Well, because they give that to their parent. I mean, they give that to their families, right? Like those families are awarded that for your son's sacrifice or whatever. But let's say that the family, they're moral relativists. But you would see them accept that probably gladly, but they can't do that consistently. Why? Because that assumes,
He's influencing.
right, as opposed to that assumes that what he's done is better in some moral sense than, say, shooting all of his fellow soldiers to save himself, right? But morally speaking, if moral relativism is true, then they're both what? Equivalent. There's no philosophical, in the relevant sense of the word, difference between the two actions. There's just no difference, right? Now, that's what's funny is that, the blame part usually comes up, but they forget the praise part, right? Now, you can go ahead to the next one. And again, this is related to that. Moral relativists can't claim anything is unfair or unjust. Why not?
Still right or wrong.
Right, because if something is fair, that means that there's a way in which people ought to behave in accord to that standard, which itself it would be fair or unfair, right? Right, so let's say that some guy, you're on the island or whatever, and some guy gives you, half of his oranges so you won't die of dysentery, right? Well, let's say something happens and he expects you to he expects you to be reciprocal in that relationship, for you to give something back. So let's say that you eat up all the oranges or whatever, and then a couple weeks pass and something happens and he finds some more fruit or whatever, and the guy says, "Hey man, I gave you those oranges, a couple weeks ago, could you share your whatever with me?" He's like, no. Well, and the guy says, well, that wouldn't be fair. But under moral relativism, there's no fair and unfair, right?
Chumps.
Right? Well, no, you can't even, there's not chumps either. Why?
Well, you want the chump, you give up.
It's not a chump. You're judging him by what? You're only a chump if you've broken some way things ought to be, right? Chump and champ, there's no difference between the two except a U and an A, right? There's no difference between the two, more philosophically speaking. So we'll keep going. We'll come back to that. Go to the next one. Now this one's odd. A moral relativist can't improve the morality. Why? Right. They can change their behavior. Why? Right. But they can't improve it, because what does improve assume? Huh? Right. That there's some standard by which they're measuring their moral obligations and moral duties and whatever against. But there's not one, right? There's not one outside of themselves, right? You can't improve your morality, and then, in fact, you can't get worse. You can't regress in your morality, right? It's just different, right? One day and you act this way another day, or at this time in your life you act this way, and at this time in your life you act this way, but neither is any better or any worse, right? Why? Because it's subjective. You are what determines what's right and wrong. There's nothing outside of yourself that does that, right? Now you can go ahead and go to the next one. Moral relativists can't hold meaningful moral discussions. Wow. So you've got two guys that claim moral relativism. Right. It's just like them sitting around arguing about which ice cream tastes better. You can't talk, because what do moral discussions and ethical discussions have to do with? They compare ideas to see which one is what? Better, right? Right, but that doesn't exist. It's literally like you sitting around talking about Fruit Loops versus, Captain Crunch or whatever. Who cares? Doesn't matter.
All I did is.
Right. Right. When in trouble, full of doubt, run in circles, leap and shout. So, meaningful moral discussions, yes or no, under moral relativism? No. Can they discuss issues of morality? But again, that's just like talking about preference under moral relativism, right? Just what you like, just what he likes. Doesn't matter. It's just your preference. Arguing about ice cream flavors, which everybody sees as what? Ridiculous. Now, I couldn't help but kind of poke a little fun here at number 7. You can go ahead and flip it. Is that relatives can't promote the obligation of tolerance. And this is where I couldn't help but just say this little, their golden calf, so to speak. Because that is one of the claims of moral relativism, right?
Yeah, but my viewpoint is immoral to be tolerant.
Exactly. There you go. But here's why it's even more ridiculous than that. If relativists can't promote the obligation of tolerance, you have to be morally tolerant. Why can't they do so?
Because it could be mine more like my morality says that you're intolerant. You're supposed to be intolerant.
Right. Well, that's what Piper said. So what's the opposite of that? What's the converse of that?
Essentially, you can't say that being tolerant is a good thing because there's no good.
Well, the very second you tell other people they have to be morally tolerant, or they have to be tolerant,
You're saying that being tolerant is good, but you can't.
you're right. You're assuming that there's some standard that they ought to behave in regard to, right? But your view says what? There's not one. So the very moment that you say you need to be tolerant of others' beliefs, you are violating your principle, right? Because that's your moral position, which is you're saying that you're not supposed to do. You can't impose your morality on other people. Literally, literally, law of non-contradiction, completely self-defeating. And again, so on what Piper and said initially, and then Lacey kind of joined in with as well, is that somebody else's view may be completely contrary, morally speaking, to your view. All right, your view says to be tolerant. My view says don't be tolerant. That's my moral position. And then even worse is if you try to apply that to other people and say they ought to behave that way, it's completely self-defeating. To say that you can't impose, if that's what you mean by tolerance, is that you can't impose your morality on other people, then that's what you're doing right now. And so it's self-defeating, literally logically contradictory. So you can go ahead and go to the next one, number 8. Now this is similar to number 5. Relativists can't have moral progress or regress, like we just said. Number 5 was they can't improve their morality, and then number 8 here is they can't have moral progress or regress. Again, this is just because your behaviors are just changing, but they're not what? Again, they're not improving, right, or regressing. They're just changing, right? Does that make sense? Kind of what we talked about with number 5. Right, that's right. All right, number 9. Moral relativists, if you embrace moral relativism, you can't simultaneously argue for rights and moral relativism. Why? Rights determined by who? Right? You? But what's so funny is moral relativists are always the one you hear talking about this kind of stuff. But how does that make any coherent sense? How does that make sense philosophically? Right. How does that make any sense? Moral relativists, all of you so-and-sos, blah, 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 blah. Look, don't you understand that morals are relative, blah, 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 and then they start talking about rights.
Well, that's what it is.
What are you talking about?
That's what it is. It's I don't need to follow my own rules.
Right. Good for you, but not for me. Right?
You exist in the space. I'm in my own vacuum over here while you worry about it.
Right. Everybody wants to be the exception to their own rule.
It's the
Right.
definition of
Right. Well, yeah, in one sense, yeah. or just to say it, I like to say it this way, is that everybody wants to be the exception to their own rule. Your own rule, and you want to be the exception to it, right?
Follow it anyway, even though I don't live up to my own standard.
Right. Or not even that I can't even do it right now in practice, right? I can't do it. I can't even do it. So imagine when we talk about, we go back to this fair and unfair notion, a moral relativist, when we talk about they can't live consistently like that, is they can't even live consistently with their beliefs. Suppose you're a moral relativist and you driving in traffic and someone cuts you off in traffic. You go, hey man, you freaking idiot, that was messed up. You can't do that. Well, if the other guy knows you're a moral relativist, leans out his window and says, I don't care if you like broccoli, see ya. Right? That's because the moral relativists can't even live consistently, right? Or what if you're in line at the coffee shop or whatever, and the moral relativist is standing there, another dude walks up, he's like, get out of the way. And she cuts in front of him. It's like, you can't do that. Notice the guy doesn't say, he walks up, cuts in front of him and say, oh, you just broke in front of me, but vanilla's pretty good. You see what I'm saying? Like, he can't even live meaning another way to say it is this. It's not existentially viable. He can't even live under his own what? System. Because he's constantly assuming what? That there are rights and wrongs, right? That other people ought to be following. He doesn't say, again, when somebody cuts him off in traffic or somebody breaks in front of him at the grocery store, he doesn't say, well, I mean, doesn't matter. I mean, this, I can't tell him what's right for him, or, God forbid, he's married and some dude comes in and
Stab him.
or, a home invasion and, starts to attack him and then to rape his wife or whatever. And he's like, well, I mean, I don't like it, but it's not wrong. I mean, he's just, this guy likes vanilla and I like chocolate. You can't even live that way. Yeah, I'm with you. I know where you are, you turds. But you see what I'm saying, though, is that you can't even live that way. Now, what's scary to me, or what's sad to me, I should say, is that people hold this view. People hold this view, but it's not even existentially viable. You can't even live consistently. You can't even live consistently with this view here. If for no other reason, if some particular system or methodology that you're holding to is existentially unviable, that at least ought to be a red flag that your system may have serious, serious problems if you can't even live consistently with it. Yeah. Well, we know which groups they go after. But anyway, so you see why I would want to laugh at this if this wasn't taught, right? If this kind of stuff wasn't taught and even, in some other ways, taught on a subconscious or implicit level. About imposing views and all those sorts of things. Like, I have kids too, right? I don't teach my kids this crap. This is pathetic. Like, moral relativism is, and again, like, I'm being, completely frank and brutally honest. It's one of the worst theories, quote unquote, ethical theories, and we're using that term loosely because technically speaking it's not one, but it's one of the worst theories in regards to ethics that I've ever heard in my life. Like, this is the stuff that destroys civilizations.
Because it's just so nice.
Right. It's so again, you get a couple sociologists and anthropologists, and again, not all of them are like that. Not all of them will hold to something like this, but you get a couple of those guys and they observe a couple cultures and then they come back with moral relativism because of that. Results in. This is, logically speaking, where your theory goes, right? Go ahead, Lacey.
This makes me think of crazy stuff going on in the Middle East, but like with very young children. And I've heard people say, well, we can't tell them what to do.
Right.
It's like their morality. And my mind is just like blown.
I heard,
like, oh, we have to keep the peace. Like, they are hurting kids. Like,
oh, but Lacey, that's just wrong in regards to your culture.
yeah, that's the way.
Are you freaking insane?
I know, like it.
But see, guys, this is the problem. This is where we are as a culture right now, because one, everybody has, I would say, this is not philosophy, so I got to be careful here, but because people don't have a backbone anymore, because heaven forbid you offend somebody. But then two, because, and again, I would say because you don't know you're not thinking critically in any shape, form, or fashion. If your worldview is telling you, and I don't know if this is what you're referencing, but I heard a thing, this was about a year ago, where a couple of military officers that were stationed in the Middle East, there were a couple of the officers in the country there where they were that were raping little boys, and they wanted to intervene. They were told, because this is so infiltrated our thinking, no, this is their culture, you have to respect that culture, you can't intervene. Well, a couple of these guys went behind their CO's back and they pummeled this guy that's raping this little boy. And, apparently others or whatever. Well, they're dismissed. They get all these repercussions, they get, quote unquote trouble, all this kind of stuff. If your worldview allows you to say that this is their culture to rape little boys and molest little boys because this is part of the grooming process, I don't care if it offends you. Something's wrong with you.
I know.
Something is wrong with that. And again, if you want to hold that, then give me an argument. And it better not be just because cultures disagree, right? Again, because philosophically, think about it. I'll let you figure that out. If disagreement implies that there's no truth on the matter, what happens?
There's no truth at all.
Well, think about the law of non-contradiction.
So
if the moral relativists is saying, look, disagreement here with cultures, they disagree on things. If that implies there's no truth on the matter, if I disagree with a moral relativist, what does that imply? If disagreement implies there's no truth on the matter, and I disagree with the moral relativist, then what does that mean? Does he think his position's true? Right. If disagreement implies that there's no truth on the matter, if I disagree with the moral relativist, that means that his position can't be true. Because he says this, I say this, we disagree. You said earlier disagreement implies there's not a real truth on the matter. If disagreement means there's no truth on the matter, if I disagree with you, that means that this view is your view can't possibly be true either. Right? So again, you better have an argument. All right, so we're still on 9, yeah. So relativists can't simultaneously argue for rights and moral relativism. Now, number 10, we'll go ahead and flip to that. It is literally self-defeating, as we've already kind of touched on. It is literally self-defeating to claim, quote, you ought not impose your morality on others. We've already touched on it. Why is that literally self-defeating? Why does that violate the law of non-contradiction?
Because they're imposing their morality.
That's right.
Don't impose the morality on people. You're imposing one.
Right, that's your moral view, right? You're imposing your moral view on me right now. When you say don't impose your moral view on other people, Russ, well then be quiet, because that's your moral view and you're imposing it on me right now. Shut up, right? Right? That's self-defeating. Or, to use the more specific jargon, that's self-referentially incoherent. Right? Self-referentially incoherent. It literally doesn't even make sense. It makes sense grammatically, but as far as the concept, you just said married bachelor. You're arguing for a married bachelor right now. That's self-contradictory to say that you can't impose your morality on other people, or to try to tell someone that they can't impose their morality on other people. It's like you're right now trying to give an argument for married bachelors. You're contradicting yourself. Now, here's the funny one. I had to put this in here just in case there was like staunch relativists in here in any of my classes. Moral relativists can't accuse those that teach against moral relativism of wrongdoing. Because what am I doing? I'm trying to argue strongly that moral relativism is wrong, right? But if you disagree with me, you can't say I'm wrong. Why? You can not like it. That's just your view, right? If moral relativism is true, that's just completely subjective to you.
Do you ever have classes where people, like classes that aren't as agreeable as this one? I'm just like curious.
Not really on this subject. Now, before we go through arguments, you have a lot of people that really will get a lot more involved when we talked about that. Remember at the beginning when I said, all right, what are some positives? What are some good arguments for moral relativism? And so you'll have a lot more there, generally speaking. But then after we run through the absurdities of what result, I'm glad to say most people are like, yeah, that's kind of, it doesn't really make a lot of sense.
In general, do you ever have someone get upset?
No, I've never had anybody get mad. Now, I have had one or two that still try to hold the moral relativism. But, I mean, again, that's, I'm not going to give you a 30 because you still hold it. I'm not going to give you a bad grade because of it, right? As long as you do your work, I mean, I'm not going to give you a bad grade. I mean, I think you're wrong, but I'm not going to give you a bad grade for it. I mean, as long as you do your work, you'll get your grade.
All I'm getting from this is mental passive.
Yeah, well, I would say that's descriptive of our culture at large right now. So now let's get into the fun one, implications for cultural relativism. What do you think that some of the implications for society says relativism? Because there's a way out of this, right? There's not a way out, but there's a side door. There's a side door, so to speak. You can say, all right, well, look, yeah, we've shown that we've got very good reason to believe that complete, I say, or subject, completely subjective relativism, moral relativism, that looks like a pretty bad option. But wait a minute, maybe we can still retreat into the side door of cultural relativism. So maybe it's not just necessarily, you are what make it right and wrong. But let's say that your culture, right? At least maybe that's defensible. That your culture decides what's right and wrong, right? So if everyone in a particular culture holds to some view, well, then that's what makes it right or wrong. So it's not just subjective, completely subjective. If everyone in our culture believes that, child molestation is wrong, well, then that's a good reason to think it really is wrong. So even if you disagree, well, look, our culture says that's wrong, man. So that's wrong. Right? So maybe that's like a side door, so to speak. Yeah, it's like your opinion, man. So that's like a side door, maybe an escape route, right? Now, is there anything wrong with that? Or first, do you think there's any positives with that? We'll take the cultural side door option. Conventionalism. Conventionalism is just this, society says, a cultural relativism. So the culture at large deems this to be right or wrong. So if you go against that, now we have a little bit of weight, right, to say that, well, there's still no quote unquote absolute morality or objective morality or whatever, but our culture is what provides the weight behind why this is wrong or whatever. All right, what's the first problem with that? Let's look at the first problem with that. Pretty big one. We're leading off with a big gunshot across the deck here, across the bow. If society says, or your culture is what deems something right or wrong, so the majority of your culture, then moral reformers, quote unquote moral reformers like MLK, Gandhi, the abolitionists, the Tiananmen Square guy, what happens to those guys? They're immoral. Why?
Trying to change people's opinion.
Well, because they went against, what did he do? At his time, what did he do?
Condemned.
He said what his culture was doing was what? His culture said it was what? Right. So if culture determines morality, which one of those guys was immoral? MLK was an immoral man, at least in regard to his fight for civil rights, right? Because if culture at large determines what's right and wrong, then he's immoral, right? if culture at large determines what's right or wrong, and you buck culture, if you go against the culture, then you are what? The immoral guy, right? But his view assumed, this guy went all these, his view assumed what? That there's a right and wrong behavior, or a right and wrong standard or let's say it this way, there's a standard of right and wrong, that it doesn't matter if his culture says is right or wrong, that they're still wrong in regard to, right? He's saying, look, all of these people here think this, in regards to the civil rights movement, or whatever MLK was objecting against. His group says this. He says, look, these guys, even though they're the majority, there's a standard over and above all of us that they're wrong and they're breaking this standard here. They're in the majority, I don't care, they're wrong in regard to it. But if this is gone, there's no such thing as this, there's no standard, then it's just preference, right? One, it's just preference, at worst. At best, if culture determines it, then there's the culture. That's the majority. So you, sir, are immoral, right? And so is Gandhi, so are the abolitionists when they try to get rid of the slave trade. Why? Because culture at large said what? Slavery was what? It was okay, right? What if the culture at large says racism is wrong? Says it's okay. Then it's okay. So if you're trying to advocate against racism, and that's not what your culture says, you are immoral. You are in the wrong, morally speaking, right? Or any of these others, gay bashing. If your culture at large thinks it's okay to bash gays and all this kind of stuff, and you in the minority say that's wrong, you are the immoral person. Slavery, non-women voters. So if that's worded stupid. It's supposed to be women voters. Yeah, have to change that. So if women don't vote and women want to vote, say the women's suffrage movement, they're wrong. They're immoral for trying to do that, right? Because culture says that that's right for them to not be able to vote, right?
There are still people in the States who argue that women shouldn't vote. For swaying the.
Well, there's still people here that think that there's a Bigfoot. So I'm not.
So this is like one big argument.
She said there's people in the States that still argue that.
No, I said what?
Oh, okay. I thought you said something else. What, Piper?
I'm saying it's just like one big appeal to popularity and appeal to tradition.
Well, not tradition, but just culture at large.
I mean, because your culture is part of its tradition.
Yeah, part of it, but traditions change, right? So you can't do it just tradition per se.
Part of this, they shouldn't ever.
Right. It shouldn't ever, if that's the case, right?
Yeah. I mean, I can't believe you even suggest something like that.
I know, I can't either. All right, so let's go to number 2. So if culture determines what's right and wrong, if your culture, society has no business, your culture, your society has no business in rescuing, improving, or helping other cultures. They're evils, right? The evils that exist in other cultures, culture just says they're what? What? That's just your cultural view, right? So in World War II, the Americans and the Allies had no business, what? Telling Nazi Germany that you can't kill Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, blacks, whoever else, right? Hey man, that's just your view. That's just your cultural view, right? If the culture is what determines right or wrong, then you have no business saying what they can and can't do, right? So again, Nazi Germany, the Canaanites and the Northern African child. So this one right here, you're probably all familiar with this, the Canaanites and all these child, killing all their kids and all this kind of things up in Moab or whoever. And then the Romans just themselves, before that time, you had an entire area in North Africa. Was it the Carthagins? I'd have to go back to my history books. But essentially, the Romans invade, go here, and basically annihilate these guys because they're tired of them killing their kids all the time. And these are what? According to ancient standards, these guys were what? Well, not these guys, but the Romans that come in. They're what? Pagans under ancient standards, right? And even they're pissed about it, right? and they go in and wipe it out. But if cultural relativism is what runs today, that did they? Because hey, man, that's just your culture. You can't do that.
Were they killing Roman kids or their own?
Their own kids,
And they just.
and they were like, "Hey, man, you're gonna stop killing your freaking kids," and they go in and
They come in and
wage
go, "What's
war on
wrong
them for
with
it.
you?" You were
Right. Now, here's the oddity of this, though. But here's the oddity. But, because what did we just say? If culture is what determines what's right and wrong, if culture, more culturally, or cultural relativism, society says conventionalism, that's what determines right and wrong. We just said that they had no business going and stopping it, right? Because that's just their culture. And here's the real odd thing. But, go ahead and flip that. What if their culture says, disagrees with what they were doing, and it's our culture to invade your culture? You see how that completely backfires on itself also? If cultural relativism says, well, wait a minute, it's their culture that deems what's right and wrong, so you can't go over there. Well, what if my culture says we go over to other cultures?
Strike.
Is
Right.
that a quote from like a book or something?
What, this here?
The bottom one, because it looks like it came from something else, or you just make it up.
Well, I had to paraphrase this. This came from a book on epistemology that I was, one of my an epistemology class I was reading. And it had to do with truth. It had to do with the issue of truth. Like, your belief doesn't determine what is or isn't true, right? Because you can believe. Well, the quote there was, it had to do with these African warriors. They had the sincere belief in this black magic or whatever, and this voodoo kind of stuff where they could, when England was doing this imperialistic type stuff, right? When they were in that era, where the British Empire, the sun never sets on the British Empire. When they were running around going everywhere and establishing colonies, and this is in the late 1700s, 1800s, that era. Well, one of the things was these African warriors that had this, voodoo and all this stuff, they believed it would protect them from the white man's bullets. The white man's bullets were like, all right,
My bullets don't.
didn't work. Even though they sincerely believed that would work against their bullets, right? It didn't work. In another example, belief doesn't determine truth. They gave this example. And I basically just said, look, this also applies to cultural relativism, because in India, when the British, whether we're going to argue the British should have been there or not, when they were there in India, what is the name of the practice where the husband dies and then they burn the widows, burn their wife on the funeral pyre with her husband? Or what's the name? I can't remember the name of the practice. Anyway, no, that was their culture. Husband dies, you burn the wife on the pyre with him. Even if she's 16, doesn't matter. 20 years old, doesn't matter. Well, so the British were over there. They're like, "Hey, man, you're not going to burn these girls up on the pyres with their. This is in the 1800s. You're not going to burn these girls up if their husband dies. You're not doing it." Well, their argument was, "This is our culture. We're doing this. This is our culture." So the British reply was, "Well, that's okay. But in our culture, we hang men and hang them. The exact words are, we hang men from their neck until they die in our culture." Right? So if the defense was, well, this is our culture to burn our women on our fires, he said, that's great, but our culture is to hang you for doing it. If your culture says that you can burn up your women, okay, because my culture says you can do it, or your culture says you can do it, but my culture says we're going to hang you by the neck until you die, if you do it. Does that make sense? So to wrap that part up, if we're to say, well, you don't have any business going into other countries or whatnot, because cultures determine morality, well, then the flip side of that is, well, what if another culture says it is their moral view to go invade other cultures, right? Then that culture can't say that's wrong. Just like they wouldn't be able to say this is wrong, because hey, it's our culture. It's our culture. We burn our women here. So okay, whatever. But if you burn them, our culture is to hang you for doing it, right? So the argument just won't work. It backfires on itself. Now, kind of wrap it up with this last point here. And this is basically just reiterates what we've just said. Suppose that two opposing cultures or societies clash with opposite values. Which one has better values and which one doesn't? Let's say that one culture allows women to vote. One culture says if women vote, they're going to be raped and killed. Which culture is better than the other?
Are we going by this?
By cultural relativism.
I'll take choice C.
They're
Right. So which culture is better? If one culture says that women should vote and they allow women to vote, and one culture says if women try to vote, we're going to rape and stone them to death.
And then
Or wait,
so they're both wrong, right?
Well, no, neither one of them's wrong.
They're both.
I thought you said about if you just disagree, then there's no truth.
No, under cultural relativism, you can't say any culture that oppose one another and their values are any better or any worse. Why? Because it's their culture that determines what's right or wrong.
It's subjective.
Right. You can't judge between them. There's no way to judge between the two. Right? So let's say that you have one culture that decides that they want to kill all the atheists in their culture. And they want to, if you're an atheist, you're murdered or whatever. And let's say the other culture says, all right, there's a culture, say across the ocean, they kill all the Christians or the theists and the, whoever, the religious people, all in one category. Which culture is better than the other one? Completely opposite views. Which one's better? Neither one. Neither one's better, neither one's worse. There's no standard by which to judge them if culture is what determines what's right and wrong. Right? Does that make sense? All right, so finishing up. What do you have to say about moral relativism? I think moral relativism is just a joke. Again, when you start to ask just a few questions and you start to analyze that in any shape, form, or fashion, I think it's just completely bankrupt. It's just utterly bankrupt. And you missed half of it, Andrew.
Yeah.
You didn't even hear the stuff that we began to talk about.
You don't want.
Yeah.
Is there a link to that?
Well, I'm recording it, so I can send it to you. But so you see why, when I said why this is so fun to talk about, because there's just nothing to it, I don't think. Now, at the end of the day, like Piper was saying earlier, like whatever ethical theory or whatever you hold to, that doesn't allow you to be a jackass, right? It doesn't allow you to be a butthole, right? But no ethical theory claims that anyway, right? You ought to be respectful in any ethical theory. But as far as to say that, but as far as to try to argue that is what gives you that, moral relativism doesn't give you anything but chaos if it's actually believed and lived out, right? Because you can't live that. You can't even live it. In fact, we'll finish up this thought and you guys can go. What would be the perfect example of someone that logically and consistently, what would we call a person that perfectly and consistently lived out moral relativism? A sociopath. Why?
They don't.
Because he does exactly what he thinks is right across the board. That's what you call someone that lives out. That's the hero of moral relativism. The hero being what? The one that can system. Right?
You're saying a sociopath?
That's him.
The hero of moral.
Is he? Because he lives it out consistently. Which is what? Insanity. Right? All right. Thanks, little helper. I'll do it. Appreciate it.
If she decided to.
She come and do it.
Yeah. I mean,
What's the number for this philosophy class?
Space, not really.
Yeah, it was a dude blows that off.
I mean, I was fine with that. It was just up until